Are you going to be knocking the table this whole time?
No.
Hello, Jake.
Hello, Tom.
How you doing?
Very well, very well. How are you?
Marvellous. Thank you.
Good bit of small talk, that.
Yes. Not sure whether it'll make it in or not.
Oh, you think it might be cut? Might not make the edit.
There's some of our podcasts where it starts off exactly as that. How you doing? I'm good. How you doing? Pretty well. Very well.
And you just ruthlessly cut it.
I didn't actually, but I'm thinking it may not be the best thing to include.
Well, unless we incorporate it in somehow, and maybe we involve it within general discussion of the podcast, such as why do we make these unnecessary small talk?
What the origins of small talk?
Not the origins, but in what way is it beneficial? Why do we say all right when we don't actually want you to say, well, actually, I don't feel all right, or I do feel all right because something happened to me and this, that. The actual response to all right is all right.
I have heard it said before that it's more of a sort of social norm in the sense that if you ask someone how they're doing, you're not really inviting them to tell you about all the problems that they have. It's more of a...
But have you ever had it where you've said something, right, and somebody has given you a response?
Well, actually,
whereby they just completely moan about it.
I had this operation, and the doctor said this, that, and the other.
20
really
minutes later, you're like, and I'm so depressed about it all.
I was just being polite. Yeah.
It's like when you meet someone, a friend of yours in the street that you haven't seen for a long time, and you're more of an acquaintance than a friend, and you say, all right? And they say, yeah, all right. What are you up to? Oh, this and that. What about you? Yeah, still living in wherever? Yeah. And, we should meet up at some point. We should, go out for a drink or something, or we can catch up for old time's sake. Yeah, well, definitely. And when they say definitely, that's just never going to happen. Because I find myself saying definitely, as in that's the end of this particular interaction now, and we're definitely going to meet up and go for that drink, just as we have all these other times over the last couple of years.
I always know that it won't happen when you actually ask for a specific time and date. So I would actually take it one step further than that. I would say, okay, when do you want to do it? And they say something along the lines of, well, I'll check with X, or I'll have a look at my diary, or whatever it might be. Maybe that's just my experience of... but I know that it doesn't go any further than that.
It's a Facebook thing as well. It's like, I never really got into the Facebook thing. A friend of mine, Simeon, said to me years and years ago, he said, Jake, I can't find you on Facebook. I said, well, I'm not on Facebook. He says, what? You've got to be on Facebook. Everyone's on Facebook. Get on Facebook. And I'm like, well, I don't really see much need to be on Facebook, to be honest. Oh, get on Facebook. And he moaned and groaned at me so much that I actually went out of my way and I set up a Facebook account and I got on there and I thought, okay, this is how it works. And this is, years ago when Facebook was relatively new. And I thought, okay, so I'll find Simeon on there. Lo and behold, I could not find Simeon anywhere on Facebook. So I phoned him up. I said, Simeon, I can't find you on Facebook. And he's like, oh no, I'm not on Facebook anymore. I value my privacy and I didn't really want to be on it. I don't see the point. I keep in touch with the friends that I want to keep in touch with, and I don't necessarily need hundreds of other people that I'm knowing all my ins and outs. And I thought, well, yes, but that's how I felt. And now I'm on Facebook. So there you go. That was my introduction to Facebook.
There are all sorts of articles now in relation to countries saying, let's say it's France or Germany or wherever, saying please don't put personal information on Facebook because people are literally using it to either identity stuff
Mm.
to take over someone's identity, or from the point of view of the safety of your children. And also even permissions that the children aren't able to give yet, that they wouldn't want at a later date to be on there. Because once it's on the internet, and let's say your profile is not private, then it's there, available, and everyone can see it. And there's all sorts of... If you think about what it used to be like in relation to privacy on the internet, it used to require all sorts of permissions, but now that, as soon as it's on social media, it's there forever.
Yeah, true. I think it is starting to go back the other way, though.
People are realising.
Yeah, and also you and I, we both work with multiple accounts, and they're always trying to sync into each other, which is very dangerous. And it annoys me where I have different browsers and I'm signed into different browsers with different accounts, and it all gets very confusing. And so I can understand the idea of syncing everything, but it's a very dangerous idea. I don't like it at all. I like to keep things separate.
There's been instances where, for business purposes, I've had to create a particular account, and you have to put your mobile in for whatever reason. As soon as you put your mobile in, it comes up with all the suggestions that you should be friends with this person, or you should connect with this person. And it's like, I wasn't intending on doing any of this.
Yeah, I know what you mean, because I get, on my mobile, I had to set up a separate Facebook account to link into a manager account. It's a long story, but there was a client of a client, and the client of the client did tarot readings and palm readings and all that kind of stuff, which I have literally zero interest or knowledge. I'm pretty convinced that they're either fake, or that the people who do them might believe that they're real, but I do not believe that you can tell the future by looking at palms or tarot or any other such thing. So it's of no interest to me, and yet I get updates on my mobile phone from Facebook suggesting Mystic Meg's tarot card fortune telling boutique, or whatever it may be, which is a bit frustrating. Not frustrating enough for me to actually do anything about it and block it, but still slightly irritating.
I think that's one of those things that I was thinking about this the other day in relation to I can't remember what I watched. I think it was the program that I told you about, the Roman Empire program on Netflix.
Oh yeah.
And how
Nautius Maximus.
The instances where the claim was that God wanted me to be either the emperor or the king or whatever it was.
Absolutely.
In relation to that. And I thought, what are the things that exist today that are similar to that? And I thought these sort of psychics and, as you say, tarot reading, all that type of thing, which actually hasn't gone away yet. And I think it will go away, because eventually people will realise that it's all complete rubbish.
Hocus and hokum.
But still, people do believe that that's the case.
I think people want to believe things like this. That's the difficulty. It's people actively defend, and this moves on. Just before we get into that, people defend their own position because it's like, if you spent a lot of money on something, say, for example, a new website or anything, new car or whatever, and it turned out to be rubbish, right? You'd actively want to defend that, would you not? You wouldn't want to admit to yourself that you made a mistake, because it's a big costly estate. You buy a timeshare apartment, you go on holiday to Spain or something, and you're walking down the beach, and somebody invites you in, to have a free meal and whatever else they do, and you go in there, you get a hard sell, and you end up buying this very expensive timeshare that you never wanted in the first place. But you can't admit to yourself that you were taken for a fool. You know what I mean? You have to defend your position, even when you deep down, because it's to the core of you. It's like, well, my self-respect,
I would say, with the caveat that unless you're philosophically trained and are willing to say, this was a mistake, and I can change my opinion if I want to, which, without going too far away from this topic, we are about to speak about something
We are
in
indeed.
relation to philosophy. But yeah, what you're talking about is commitment and consistency.
Commitment
I
and
want
consistency.
to be consistent with the commitments I've already made.
Yeah.
Which, if you think about it logically, there's absolutely no reason why you can't say this was a mistake. There's no reason for me to take that action, so I'm not going to do this anymore.
Yeah, consistency is an interesting thing. But just before we go on and talk about that, I just want to close about Facebook in that my daughter tells me that only old people use Facebook.
Well, there's new media, isn't there?
Yeah.
Snapchat is, I've heard it referred to as, I don't know which letter it is, either generation, I want to say Generation Z, but I'm not sure whether it's Generation X, one of the two. It's the one after millennials. Supposedly, that particular media, Snapchat, is the most popular with that particular demographic.
So, I'm Generation X. This
Must
I
be
know.
said then.
So you are, 10 years my junior?
I'm a millennial, yeah.
So you're a millennial?
According to those definitions, that's what I would be, yes.
Yeah, see, I don't think of you as a millennial, I think. But anyway, yes, you are, in fact, as determined by whoever determines these things, you are a millennial. And so I thought, well, what are my daughters then, who were born after the millennium? And it turns out that my daughters are apparently post-millennials, because there's no name for it which has actually been specifically agreed upon at this point.
But according to the Google, Generation Z or Gen Z, also known by a number of other names, is the demographic cohort after the millennials.
Yeah.
Demographics and researchers typically use the mid-1990s to mid-2000s as starting birth years. There is little consensus regarding ending birth years. So I'm sure it will
become a thing, as Generation X was. My mother and father were baby boomers, so Generation X sounds much cooler. Millennials doesn't sound cool, I don't think. It just sounds a bit...
Millennials get pretty trashed,
They
to be fair.
They do.
And
they have a rough time
I think
of it.
in some instances with good reason, but it is a generalisation at the same time.
It's a massive generalisation. But also, in baby boomers, there's a huge difference as well between the earlier baby boomers and the later baby boomers, because, we're talking about the 1960s, and there's a huge shift in all sorts of, massive cultural shift during that time. And so there's a big difference between, I think all of these things are pretty vague and pretty rough. I kind of like to think of my daughters as post-millennials, because it has the word post in it, which makes me laugh a little bit, because but if they are Generation Z, then that makes you, by default, Generation Y?
Why did this happen?
Why? Why am I Generation Y? Anyway, we move off topic. I know that you wanted to discuss, some more slightly philosophical things.
One thing I had, which we normally do at the beginning, which is word of the day.
Word of the day.
Word of the day, apparently, is perspicacity.
Perspicacity.
And the definition is keenness of mental perception and understanding, which is quite poignant for today's conversation.
Poignant is a good word. Could you repeat it again?
Perspicacity.
That sounds like what kind of person would introduce that into a normal sentence?
Quote, this early work shows that, insert name here, had yet to achieve his radical style, but his perspicacity and wit were already fully formed.
Wow.
I doubt I'll be using this one, I must admit.
No, it's a very highly developed word, isn't it? It doesn't sound right. It's someone's come up with that. I'd like to know who came up with that word. Was it someone who sat there and just invented a word and thought, that's now a word, and now I need to sort of promote that word? We could sit here and invent a word like Fardensplitter and tell everyone that Fardensplitter means something, and then it might mean preposterous word. Fardensplitter. Oh, what a Fardensplitter that was. And then, we introduce it enough times around certain places. I mean, is it possible to create a word which ends up being in the dictionary?
I think it is, yeah. Because there's plenty of words which they introduce that are actually sort of phrases. So I've heard in some instances, I've heard the word for is now in the dictionary, or as I shouldn't say now because it's not that new, but basically as a phrase is used, eventually if it gets picked up by a certain number of people, it is introduced in the dictionary.
It reaches terminal velocity.
It's an expression which indicates sexual attraction from one gender to another or something like that. So if one...
What is for?
Yeah, for.
But then that's gender bias because what if it was the same gender?
Well, either I doubt I've got the definition correct,
I think you've defined it now. That's it.
I didn't know we were going to talk about this on the podcast.
No, absolutely not. There you go. Why not?
Shall we move on?
Let's do it.
So, we were going to talk about Socrates today. And just because it's an interesting topic, I did not much, but I did a little bit of research on it to prepare for the call.
Okay,
and the interesting thing that I found was, of the information that's available, I would say half, maybe even more, maybe a majority of the information that's out there, if you ever want to look, is more to do with his personal story about who he is and how he died, etc., more than what his ideas are and what his positions are on certain things and the reason actually why he's popular in the first place.
That's interesting. Are you referring to doing a little bit of research on the internet?
Yes, that's how I do my research now.
Okay, so can you give us a little bit of a background about him, seeing as that's what anyone who's interested, it's all available on the internet, so you can look and you can use the Google.
He is, well, I'll probably botch it because I'm unprepared, but I'll have a go anyway. He is termed the father of philosophy, in the sense that philosophy at that time is only about 100 years old, so not a very new discipline. And he taught people like Plato, who I believe taught Aristotle, and then Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, and these are all very influential characters throughout the time.
Can I just interject? So Alexander the Great is famous for his military exploits.
He's I was going to say an amazing conqueror, but that sounds like a positive thing.
Yeah.
It's not a positive position that I would take. He was a very successful conqueror.
Yeah. So, not necessarily well known for his philosophical...
Yeah, that's a bit of a failure, isn't it?
I
would say. It's not a very... it sort of seems like the lessons maybe may have missed Alexander the Great there.
Okay. All right.
For whatever reason.
So he was a bit of a Greekie, and he liked yogurt, I presume, and sitting around in the shade because it's very hot and sunny in Greece, and eating olives, and generally he sounds pretty pleasant. So
he was a bit of a rebel in the sense that he was willing to question the status quo. So he would what he actually was. So he was sentenced to death by the state, but he was willing to question the gods that the state recognised, and he was also willing to encourage...
So he was a heretic, essentially.
Yeah, perhaps. Encourage the young to question the old, that sort of thing. Ah. So the other thing that he was accused of is turning the young against their parents or whatever.
Oh, right.
If that's the right term.
Oh, dear.
And he was found guilty, and when he was found guilty, he said that his penalty should be that he gets free meals
Well, of course.
Because they gave him an opportunity to say, what should your punishment be?
Oh, really? So they said, right, well, you've been a very naughty boy, Mr. Aristotle. What do you feel is an appropriate... It's like something you can imagine when you're hauled in front of the headmaster.
Yeah.
What do you feel is an appropriate punishment for this young man?
And he's basically saying, I
free,
should be
free
rewarded.
school meals, please, sir.
Yeah. Because he didn't say, something I've done is wrong here.
Well,
and
presumably the weather's nice in Greece, so he didn't necessarily need a roof over his head, but...
Well, he didn't have a job.
No, because he was sitting around philosophizing and...
He was, yes. He didn't, according to the descriptions of him, he didn't bathe very often.
Well, there's no excuse for that in Greece. There's a beautiful sea everywhere. Just jump in, mate.
Yeah, well, he's a bit of a... some would refer to him as a bit of a bum. But he liked to discuss ideas and question people. And, he didn't do much else, I don't believe. Except for, in his earlier life, he was a soldier.
Mm.
So he did fight in battles and that
probably
sort of
fairly
thing.
Common back in those days, I imagine.
And there was a story about him, it sounds like more of a parable to me.
Okay.
And this gets to the point of what some people think. And there's some theories out there which say that Plato created him as a fictional character in order to teach people lessons and that sort of thing.
So he may not be a real fellow. Jury's out.
Yeah, I would say because there are multiple accounts of him and there was a play about him and that sort of thing, you would think that it's probable that it is the case that he was a real person.
Yeah.
But there are positions where people said,
Like Robin Hood. Was Robin Hood a real person?
I was going to say Robert Kiyosaki with Rich Dad.
Okay, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, yeah.
Yeah, because I think it's the case that Robert Kiyosaki says that his rich dad isn't just one person, it's multiple people. And if you're Plato, and also we've talked about it briefly before, Plato talked about the noble lie and how, maybe it would be a good way to teach people if there's this one person who's trying to question people's beliefs and that sort of thing.
So if he was a bum...
Yeah.
I imagine him now sitting by a beach somewhere underneath the shade of a tree because it's very hot and sunny. He can't quite muster the energy to go and have a dip in the sea because he doesn't wash very often. And he's eaten all the fruit off the tree, or it's the middle of summer and there's no fruit. So he gets punished, and he says that he feels that his punishment should be free school meals. Free meals, no school for him. And so how do we know all this? Why is he famous?
So one of the things which is always stated is that he never actually wrote anything down himself.
So he had a Jesus complex. Except he was before Jesus.
He was before Jesus, yeah. Plato was the one who wrote, I believe, the majority of stuff down from him, but there's multiple accounts, as I said.
So he was a holy man?
Not a holy man, no. He questioned. He was
a free thinker, a radical thinker.
Yeah.
Like it.
And one of the things which I think is really important to think about, and it ties into the parable that I was going to say, was one of the biggest impacts that is used today is called the Socratic method.
Okay.
Which I'll try and do justice to in explaining it. But one of the stories is that there's some sort of I won't give it a label because I'm missing it, but some sort of wise person who he sends someone to go and ask. Supposedly this person can answer any question. So if you want a question answered, then this is the person who can answer it.
The wise man.
Sort of like a top of the mountain type thing.
I'm envisaging a great big long beard and someone sitting down in a sort of Hindu guru style cross-legged way.
And this person says, who is the wisest man in the world? And he says Socrates is the wisest man in the world. And Socrates says, he openly says, well, if I feel like I know nothing, which was his position, I've done all this research and I feel like I don't know anything. How can it be that I am the wisest man in the world? So I'm going to disprove this person. And so he goes to the people who claim to be wise or claim to know things, and he begins to question them. At the time, what we now know as the Socratic method.
Okay.
And realizes that the people who claim to know things actually don't know anything.
So the Socratic method is the methodology that he used in order to identify whether people know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds useful.
The reason why he's termed the wisest man is because at least he knows that he doesn't know much, whereas the people who claim to know don't know that they don't know.
So a kid at my school, upon receiving quite poor exam results, said, "All I know is I'm clever," which I always thought was fantastic. All I know is I'm clever. And he is a very clever guy, maybe not academically, but in other ways. So how do we use the Socratic method?
So there are different ways to use it, but one of what I would say is the most challenging way to use it is the first thing that you would do in those types of instances is to define terms. So the first thing I would do in that instance is I would say, what is clever?
Okay, that's another whole topic.
And let's say that person would say, well, I have the ability to do complex things. And then that would be the definition that they give. And then the follow-up question to that would be, building the problem with this particular thing is...
So I'm a maths genius. I can do all sorts of calculations.
Yeah, I can do complex things. And then you would pick something which is perceived not to be complex, but is difficult. And you would say, well, is this person clever? Let's say, trying to think of something now. If you were to take an animal or something that could do something that we couldn't do, and which is a complex thing, what would that be? An animal that can do a complex thing.
They did this experiment in a zoo, I think, with children and a bird. I can't remember what kind of bird it was. A parrot, I think, some kind of parakeet. And they had water, and they had a tube with a sweet in the bottom of the tube. And the tube was fixed to the table, so you couldn't get it off. And they said to the children, if you can get the sweet out, you can have it. And the children are like, oh, great. And they're trying to find things and dig things down into the hole and trying to get the sweet out, trying to stab the sweet, but it was a hard sweet, so they couldn't stab it, and they couldn't reach it with their fingers and all sorts of other things. And they did the same thing with a nut, with the parakeet, and the parakeet just immediately took a mouthful of water and spat it into the tube and filled the tube up to the point where the parrot was able to reach in and grab the nut. And they tried this with many, many children and different parrots, and the parrots immediately were able to figure it out. It didn't require any kind of learning process. They just seemed to automatically know the answer straight away, whereas human children could figure it out as soon as they saw another person do it. But until they'd seen that other person do it, they struggled and struggled and struggled, and some of them figured it out and some of them gave up.
I think one that's come to me is that I've heard it to be the case that bees tell other bees when they've found flowers or whatever, where the pollen is, essentially, with physics. So they make particular movements which are based on physics to tell the other bees. And then you might say, well, that's a complex thing. Can you do it? And obviously the question is no. And therefore, does that mean that bees are clever? And then what you have to do then is sort of add another layer of definition onto your initial definition. So it might be, you might go for almost like a cop-out. So it would be, well, I'm a human that can do complex things. And then you would find another thing on top of that, to the point where And there are some instances where you can get good definitions, but
Could-
even with simple things.
Could you say that, for example, someone who is incredibly good at maths, again using that as an example, was able to do complex mathematical equations, but was rubbish at English, or was poor at communicating with people or interacting socially?
Well, you just gave a good example, because if you were to say, well, I'm clever because I can do very advanced maths, you might say, well, this, well, not a great example, because I was going to say this physicist can't do maths. Does that mean that he's not clever or she's not clever? And obviously the example is, yes, they are clever, but they can't do maths, so you need to redefine your definition. Or redo your definition in order to... And basically the lesson that's learned, whether I've been able to describe it properly, is that defining words is actually very difficult. And it's even more difficult when it's something which is a generalized term, like, for example, truth or justice, something like that.
Sure.
Because the lesson is that when we're talking to each other, we have presumptions or assumptions that we're talking about the same thing. So when you're talking about truth and you tell me what it means, it may not be
Your
what I
definition.
think it is.
Yeah.
And if we can't even agree on the concept of what truth is, how are we even going to have the same conversation?
Good point.
And once you sort of get those definitions and ask those definitions, then you can go into whether or not you can make progress from that. But if you can't even agree to a definition, or you can't even define the thing that you're talking about, it's an example of how you don't even know that you don't know something, because you can't even define what you're talking about.
That's true. Yes, there are definitely there are different levels of awareness. So that you know that you don't know very much, then you learn a little bit more. So now you know that you know a bit more than you did. Then you get to a point where you're pretty confident that you know a subject inside and out. And then you go to the next level, whereas that you realise, in fact, that you were wrong and you don't know that subject half as well as you thought you did, and so on and so forth. So in other words, Socrates was at the point where he realised that he was aware enough to realise that he didn't know that much about things. There is a documentary from the History Channel it's called Genius, and the first series, I think there are 2 series at the moment, but the first one is about Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein was very much like that, as portrayed in the... he struggled to get into university, and he struggled to get into university because he was extremely good at maths and physics, but had very little interest in other subjects, which were required passes in order to enter university at that time. And so he actually had to go away for a year. He failed to get into university, but they were so impressed with his maths and his science that they said, look, go away and just get scrape through with a pass in these other subjects next year, and you can come into the university. And that's what he did. He went away and he learnt enough just to get a scrape through with a pass in these other subjects, which is a tick box exercise, because really what actually happened is that the people who were in charge of this realised that he didn't fit into the norm, and that he in fact was extremely intelligent, but it was very, very defined in a certain area. He was extremely intelligent in that because, let's be fair, these are the areas that really interested him. And so he dedicated his knowledge and acquirement of knowledge and thought process and everything else in terms of trying to understand these concepts, physics mainly, and had no or little or no interest in other things. So he never developed in those areas. But then when he did get into university, he really struggled and was universally unpopular with the lecturers, because the lecturers would be telling you, this is blah, 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 blah. And this is Einstein, sorry. This is So Isaac Newton's theory on gravity, and this, that, and the other, and poor old Albert, he'd already learned about all these things because they interested him, and he'd already learned about them. He's just getting a qualification, effectively. But there were bits about them that he found annoying, in that they didn't know the answers to questions, and he was interested in the areas of physics that we didn't know the answer to. And so he was constantly questioning his lecturers and undermining his lecturers' authority because the lecturers didn't know the answers to these questions. And so they wanted to get rid of him, and he was universally unpopular. And eventually he was thrown out and went off to work in the patent office, and then started, because universities wouldn't accept him, he started writing his own papers. And the rest is history. But it's interesting that I think he fits in because he's a bit of an enigma in terms of the fact that his genius was that he questioned things. So he was like Socrates. He was one of these people who said, well, I'm not interested in what I know. I want to know what I don't know. Is that fair?
Yeah. I was trying to think of the example. I mean, it sounds very much like the Socratic method in the sense that once you then define terms, you tend to realise that once you start asking questions about things, let's say your I'm clever example, we only really can go back 3 or 4 questions before we realise that a lot of the things that we think about, that we've made assumptions about, or which we feel are true, not many layers to that once you start asking questions. So an example of the Socratic method might be, how do you know that you're clever? And so you'd have to come up with an example, well, relative to most people, I can do things that other people can't do. And then that might be, well, how many people have you determined, what's the sample size of the people that you have tested this against?
Yeah.
And then, I'm not sure what that might be, maybe hundreds or something like that. And okay, well, how did you test that empirically to determine that you've made the right conclusion? And once you start asking these questions,
so it's like a scientific method. It has a logical procedure. It's a process that you follow.
Yeah.
So when somebody comes up to you with a statement of fact, or so-called fact, and then starts arguing that point, do you sort of step back and use this method to determine whether these people are correct, or whether their theory is flawed? Or how do you use this method?
I haven't. There are some times where I've used it.
Yeah.
But it makes people uncomfortable, because you're asking people to justify what their statements are. And the stories are that Socrates annoyed a lot of people.
I can
because
imagine.
People like to think that they know certain things, and if you can prove that they don't know certain things, then that's going to be annoying for them.
So Sheldon Cooper.
Well, Sheldon's very much of the opinion that he does know a lot of stuff.
Yeah, but he also annoys a lot of people because he does actually know a lot of stuff, but he also hasn't reached that level where that he knows that he doesn't know a lot, perhaps.
Well, I'm not sure.
I mean, he's a fictional character.
Fictional character, and science or physics in his case is different than the philosophical discussion. So if someone was to make a claim like I'm clever, if you were to go through the Socratic method with them, there wouldn't be much that it's based on, and they'd probably feel quite uncomfortable once you get to the 3rd or 4th question.
I have we'll come back to this very, very briefly, but I have a bit of my own thought is that someone who is very, very clever would be well balanced as an individual. If you got to the point where you were really, really switched on, not just in one particular area like physics, like Albert Einstein, but generally you'd have a balanced personality. And if that was the case, then you wouldn't make silly mistakes. You wouldn't be egotistical. You wouldn't have jealousy issues and so on and so forth. And it's something I'm thinking of at the moment, but I haven't really reached a conclusion about it. But one of the things that I find interesting is that if you were really, really intelligent, then surely you would get life. Do you know what I mean?
Well, if we use the method here, I mean, we would say, well, what is intelligent? And then we could say, well, are people intelligent who, they can't even, if you what are they called, the people who can like memorize phone books, savants, for example, are savants intelligent? And you have to say, well, they have a form of high intelligence, but a lot of the time they can't do the basic
simple things. Yeah, so
then what are we talking about?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. There is no clear definition of intelligence, and I think that there never really will be because it's all encompassing. My friend, who's not very academically gifted, is one of the most intelligent people I've ever met in other ways. I mean, he has the ability to remember numbers like you can't imagine, but he's also got an incredible way with people. He can get things done. He can make friends and influence people naturally to an incredible degree. So, for example, he to go to the football, good example. There is an area where you can only park your car if you are, if you pay a huge amount of money every year, a season ticket holder, and you pay a large amount of money to be able to park near the stadium. And he has very quickly and very easily talked his way into being able to park there for free every time. And this is just by being able to engage with people think incredibly quickly, and just have the answers to hand. He can just naturally, it's very quick thinking, and he can naturally just say the right things at the right time and get the result that he wants, to a degree that I've never seen anyone else do. And he uses it to his advantage. So in that way, he's extremely intelligent, and he's a very intelligent guy. But on paper, if you got him to exams, he may not be so. I mean, he may now, but at school he was average in terms of exam results.
Another example of that might be
IQ tests. Is another example.
For example, Trump is able to get what he wants a lot of the time. But does that mean that he's intelligent?
Well, it appears to be. I mean,
it's not to say that he's not intelligent. It's just whether or not he's using ethics when he's making claims about things.
But interestingly, the fellow that I just talked about, he thinks that Trump is incredibly intelligent.
Well, there are
doesn't like him at all.
doesn't
like Trump at all, doesn't agree with him or his views or anything, but does think he's way more intelligent than people give him credit for. It doesn't come across as intelligent, but perhaps it's like a chess game, and perhaps he sees stuff that other people don't see.
I know that there are certain people who make those claims. I'm not 100% convinced, in the sense that if you look back at there's documentaries and that sort of thing, but if you look back at some of the things that how he's achieved certain things, and there's phone call conversations of him pretending to be his publicist and that sort of thing, and I think he's more goal orientated without the need to be honest about things. So you might say he's a great campaigner, so he's able to get people to come round to his way of thinking, which comes back to what you were saying about influencing people.
Yeah.
But whether or not he's willing to bend or break the rules in some instances, I think that doesn't necessarily require intelligence, I don't think. But it meets the goal of what you were referring to, in the sense that he can meet whatever his goals are without necessarily being intelligent. But I'm only
not
using
being
that.
Formally intelligent. It just certainly doesn't appear to be. But But yeah, perhaps he had. Well, he certainly is intelligent in certain ways because he's an incredibly rich, powerful, influential person. And you might say, and I hear a lot of people say, "Well, I don't want money, and I don't want this, and I don't want that," and so it's not been my goal. And they'd be correct if you know, if your goal is to be a more generous person, to be a more balanced person, to be more helpful, or whatever it is, then perhaps you've never had a goal of, achieving wealth. But there are many, many millions of people whose primary goal is to achieve wealth. And when you think about Trump, he's definitely an overachiever in that particular area. So I don't know. I mean, I don't like the guy. I've said it. I know. It's a strange opinion to come from, I know. But I don't like him. I don't like what he stands for. I don't like very much about him at all. He's kind of, it's just definitely not someone I would like to invite to dinner, let's just say. But perhaps he has got a form of intelligence, and perhaps there's I don't know. I mean, when we look at our own politicians, and one of the things that I mentioned to you is that I find it frustrating. Sometimes when I go to the gym and I'm on the machines and I plug in and watch a bit of daytime TV when I'm working, when I'm working out, and the politics show or whatever it's called is on quite a lot, and so I watch it, and sometimes Prime Minister's questions, and it occurs to me that our current political system is based on people who it's like a debating society, in that they're not really debating a subject in terms of they're not coming together and saying, well, look, like Socrates, I realise I don't know the answer to this particular question. They come in like a bit more like a kind of born-again Christian, convinced that they're right, and they'll defend that opinion to the hilt. And so you have these two main parties in the UK, at least. You have the Conservatives and the Labour Party, and they both have very clearly defined. In fact, right now is an interesting time because the parties are all splitting apart over the Brexit issue. But generally, they have a very clearly defined point of view, and it might be the party point of view, which they agree with or disagree with or whatever. But the Conservatives have this point of view, and they will defend it because they're convinced they're right. And Labour has this point of view, and they'll defend that because they're convinced they're right. And they'll sit there, and you'll see them on TV, and they'll be arguing that point as if they've come to the conclusion that they definitely are correct, like a born-again Christian, and nothing that anyone else can say is ever going to sway their belief that they are right. And furthermore, they're actually going to actively try and persuade everyone else that everyone else is wrong. And it just seems like extremely childish behaviour to me. I look at these politicians, the people who've been elected into power, and I just think that they are literally children running around arguing over something in a school playground. It's not a mature way of fixing problems. I like tea, I like coffee. Well, coffee's better than tea. No, tea is better than coffee. And we're going to argue these points forever. It's ridiculous. Whereas what they should be doing, in my view, is saying, like Socrates, that I don't know the answer. This is what I know so far, and I'm going to tell you what I believe. But what I really am looking for is that you tell me something that makes me change my mind, that gives me a bit of some missing information that I didn't previously have, something that makes me question what I already know. And by doing so, I'm not trying to defend myself and my insecurity. I'm actually growing and learning and becoming a better person for it. So for me, what I would like to say is, like, for example, Brexit, which is currently the big problem now. You've got one group who's convinced that Britain's better off outside of Europe. One group's convinced that Britain's better off inside Europe. And they'll just sit there and argue these points, and they're not changing their minds. And they can't both be right, which then therefore makes me believe that they must both be wrong, because you can't have a defined point of view unless you know it to be factually correct. So I know that 1 + 1 = 2. This is a fact, and it You can test it scientifically or by however other method you like. 1 + 1 is 2, and that's that. There's no argument about it. But, whether Britain should leave Europe, well, that's just it's a very complex question that I don't know all the answers to. So how can I possibly have an absolutely solid, defined answer to that? Surely we've got politics all wrong, and we've got the way that that the countries are run. It's just wrong. It's childish.
There's a couple of things there. In relation to that, that question, and I think it's based on people's goals. So, should we leave the EU, for example, are based on that individual person's goals. So if you want, for example, more freedom, you might advocate for Brexit because you might theoretically have more chance of creating rules for your country. Whereas if your goals are, for example, looking after people, and the potential for Brexit is going to be quite detrimental to that goal, then you're going to argue in the other position.
Yeah.
But it is opinion. So I've told you this before about what I think politics is now, and that is that if you've got a particular position on how the country should be run, it isn't an argument, it's an opinion. And so anyone can have one. And so if you're just arguing about opinions, then what's the point in doing that? You're wasting your time, essentially. But I do also think that it's possible for people to be right about a particular policy and not recognise it. So the example I use with this is minimum wage. So a conservative position is if you raise the minimum wage, you're going to get people essentially fired from their jobs, because if a business has an additional cost, let's say if you have 2 employees and the minimum wages rise from £10 to £20, for example, you're going to cut one of them and make the other one do the work, for example, and it's going to stop people from getting employed because you're stopping people entering the workforce. Whereas the position on the left is that you can't look after a family if you're only on, for example, £10 an hour or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Both of them are right, but they're arguing with each other even though both of them are right.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point.
And then the other thing, coming back to Socrates...
Can I just interject very quickly before we come back to Socrates? See, in some ways, I think of all of this as just a big smokescreen, because they're not actually asking the correct questions. And the correct questions are, if they're both right about this, why is that the case? Why do people require more to live? What's going wrong? And it all comes back. I spent a few years just immersing myself in learning as much as I could about economics. I found it fascinating. And I think the primary thing I learned about economics is that it's absolutely fundamental to everything else, in that there is no real such thing as politics. Politics is just people's reactions to certain things. Now, what I mean by that is that it's always determined by economics. If there's enough money in the economy and people are generally feeling that there's money and that things are booming and that they feel safe, they've got enough to eat, they can afford to do nice things, then the politics tend to be pretty soft. No one wants to make a change, everything's good, but the boom time never lasts very long, and this is a whole other subject, so I'm not going to digress into economics and why this happens and doesn't happen and so forth. And as you know, different politicians have different ideas about how to control the economy and so on and so forth. I don't want to go down that road. What I mean is that all of the current things that we've got now, the Brexit vote, the far right growing within Europe, for example, Trump, all of these sort of more extreme politics are a direct relation to the fact that we had a big economic crisis. And in fact, the big economic crisis hasn't really been solved. It's just, the can's been kicked down the road because they haven't actually solved the problems. And in many cases, I don't think they're even asking the right questions about what caused it. And I hear a lot of people, if you Google what caused the economic crisis in 2007, 2008, they'll say, well, it was because subprime mortgages. So then you go, okay, well, so suddenly something called subprime mortgages appeared and ruined the economy. No, of course not. So what caused subprime mortgages? And if you bring it back and back and back and back, eventually you get to the kernel of some of the issues, and they may be different kernels and they all interact that come to that point. But my point is that the economic crisis hasn't been solved. The economic crisis has caused people a great deal of pain. Certain governments have really struggled, and Greece, for example, has had tremendous problems, and Cyprus and places like this, Italy. All over Europe, there have been political problems, many of which have come from this economic crisis originally.
Yeah, the countries that have the most volatility recently are the ones which are doing the worst in terms of the amount of debt they have.
Exactly.
So it's almost driven by economics.
It isn't almost, it's completely driven by economics. It's just people's reactions, and because there's no consensus on how to deal with what's causing this problem in the first place, then you get people on the right going, it's this, and we need to take this action, and we need to, people like Trump who say, oh, people are going to lose their jobs to all the foreigners coming in across the border, so we need to build a wall, People aren't going to lose their jobs to foreigners. That's old news. People are going to lose their jobs, all right, but it's because of technology, not because of Mexicans and South Americans coming across the border. That's a 20th century issue. We're now in the 21st century. And there's a lot of smoke screens, a lot of wasted conversations, and in my view, where people in power are actively, or maybe, they're unaware of it and they're just naive, but they're focusing on issues that aren't issues going forward. They're not future-proofing their countries. And I think a lot of the problems that have caused this, and all sorts of economic issues and different levels of inflation. So, for example, I think I know that we are constantly given false information about the true level of inflation. I know that my shopping bill over the last 3 years has gone up roughly twice. It costs me now twice as much as it did to get the same products. Not quite twice, but nearly twice as much as it did about 3 years ago. And yet, if you look at the levels of inflation that politicians and the Bank of England, etc., state, they're very, very low levels of inflation. And wage increases, wage freezes, they're all basically due to, they're all tied or linked into inflation levels, and they're all sort of political ways of managing the economy. But these are cause and effect issues. The reason that people have need a minimum wage and in order to survive, for example, is because the minimum wage is a figure that they've come to, which, if you don't earn that, a living wage at least, if you don't earn a living wage, you can't raise a family, you can't survive. You're kind of thrust into poverty. And they can argue, the left and the right, Conservatives, Labour, they can argue, like you said, and they can be having the same argument, but they're not actually looking at the cause and trying to resolve that. And this is the thing that I find stressful, and it stresses me out when I sit there and I listen to Prime Minister's questions, or I listen to our politicians, they famously never answer a question. Well, I can understand they don't answer a question because now they're going to be kept forever on a TV thing. There's a clip of them saying something and it can ruin their career down the road. So of course they're going to say as little as possible. But when they do say something, they're just trying to defend their own preformed ideas. And they're never actually saying, how can we address this particular issue? And coming together and saying, okay, well, I think it's this. No, I think it's that. Oh, okay, that's a good one. I hadn't thought of that. And coming together and having a mastermind kind of, I don't know, some kind of consent, trying to figure out consensus to find the solution, and they don't do it. And I think you're right. I think it's their own interest.
Well, I was going to say about the thing you mentioned about changing your mind, and the incentive in politics is all wrong there because they call it a flip-flop. So if you have one position for a certain period of time and then change your mind, it's almost like a negative thing. It's not a positive thing. And Socrates, I think it was Socrates, said that if you don't get involved in politics, then your inferiors will be the ones ruling over you. So in the sense that, you know, we should be changing our minds based on a good argument or good evidence is a bad thing. It's an example of that. The fact that you can't even change your mind without it being viewed as a negative thing, whereas it should be a positive thing.
Well, within the business world, there's, you know, a lot of people would say the best thing you can do is make a mistake because you'll definitely learn from that. And if you don't learn from that, and you make the same mistake twice, then well, you've only got yourself to blame. Right?
Failure is feedback. Yeah.
Failure is feedback, and therefore, I mean, I can't think of many more people who've failed than generation after generation of politician. I mean, you know, we look at the state of things right now. You know, things have always been bad, but we should be in a better position. And if we change the way that politics works, then perhaps we could really make some movement towards progress. You know what I mean? Instead of just treading water at best, which is what we're doing currently, in my view. Yeah, I think I find it frustrating that, and I wonder if you know, you say, you know, you hear this phrase, football is the opium for the masses and TV is the opium for the masses. Could modern politics be the religion for the masses? You know, if you look at Jesus, for example, or any other kind of religious figurehead, they've always made a change, and Jesus was killed for all our sins, blah blah blah. But really, politically, Jesus was challenging the status quo. You know, he was upsetting people who had a vested interest in keeping things exactly as they currently are, and you know, isn't that what's happening in politics? You get the Conservatives in, you get the Labour Party in, and they make a few subtle changes, but you've got vast numbers of people in the States it's the same. You've got, okay, so you've got, 8 years of Obama, and then you've got Trump, and Trump has just basically wiped out some of the things that Obama had put in place, and then the pendulum will swing again, and it will, you know, and this is just a constant sort of, like a wave on the ocean. It's just a constant thing. It goes up and down, but nothing really ever changes.
One thing about that's relevant to this particular podcast anyway is the opinion about democracy, which I did mention to you recently, and it's Socrates used an analogy about democracy, about a ship. So who would you like to be sailing a ship? Would you like a bunch of people to vote on what's the best way to do a ship, or get you to a particular location rather? Or would you like an expert to make sure that they know where they're going? And then the other thing is the sweet shop owner versus the doctor. So let's say you have an election, and one person's a doctor and one person's a sweet shop owner. And the doctor is saying, you know, the reason why I do these, operations or give you medicine that you have to do or something like that is for your long-term well-being. And then the sweet shop owner says, well, I give you things that you like. You know, I give you chocolates and whatever it might be. And I would never make you go through these things that this doctor does. And then the question is, if you were to put those two people up for an election, would the masses be able to ascertain who's going to be acting in their best interests? Would they hire the sweet shop owner, or would they, elect the doctor? And the opinion is that we'd hire or elect an awful number of sweet shop owners, which is the current state of our politics,
Yeah, I
essentially.
think that is basically what happens.
And that's why he did not like democracy.
Mm.
And I think, as much as I think that it's, should we say smeared? Is smeared the right word around trying to stop people from voting who otherwise don't know much about politics?
Yeah.
I don't see anything wrong with the logic there.
No.
And so really you have to say, well, it's probably correct if there's not anything wrong with the logic, even though I'm uncomfortable about the conclusion, which is stopping people from voting who otherwise don't know anything about politics. It's probably correct.
That's always been a bit of an issue, because originally it was only the sort of members of the aristocracy or very influential, powerful people who had the right to vote. And over years it sort of watered down to more and more people, all men, never women. And then finally with the, when was it, in the Edwardian times, I think if I'm right, Australia was the first place to give women the vote, well, certainly in the modern world. But then, women then got the right to vote. And more people are now getting the right to vote. And it's a hard-earned right. But it's now they're talking about 16-year-olds having the right to vote. And in some cases, I think in the referendum that Scotland had in terms of leaving the United Kingdom, 16-year-olds were allowed to vote there. And you can't just base it on gender, on age, on social background, or any of these things. It's got to be also based on, you either give everyone really has a right to speak and have their voice heard. In other words, a right to vote, or you're determining which groups of people can and cannot have this right. And it's a bit of a strange question. It's not one that I've normally given much thought to, if I'm completely honest. But
it is a genderless and I would say, ageless issue. Only providing certain criteria are met if we're going to talk about this type of thing. So if a 15-year-old was here and they were able to talk to us about the positives and negatives of certain policies or certain positions that you take within politics, don't actually think that there's a reason why they shouldn't be able to vote. But if you were to say, take the average 15-year-old and say, what do these people know about politics? It probably wouldn't be very much, and it might be the case that they elect the sweet shop owner if you were to...
There's another question, is that things change over time, and older people find it... The more you realise that you understand a subject, I mean, say, for example, I learned Spanish. So I learned Spanish. I can now get to the point where I can have the same conversation that we're having now in Spanish as opposed to in English. And I'd make occasional grammatical errors, but if you were a Spanish person, we could have the same conversation. You'd understand me and I'd understand you. And that'd be fine. But I could take it further. I could continue my study of Spanish. I could improve my Spanish if I really wanted to a level where it was better than most native-speaking Spanish people. I could have a deeper vocabulary. I could have a greater understanding of the verb endings and so on and so forth. So it is possible that I could do that. And it just sort of begs the question as to sort of how much, how much knowledge do you have to have? Where do you draw the line as opposed to... Do you know what I mean?
It would have to be a pretty simple test.
Okay.
Because, I don't know, I don't think it's a good thing to drastically restrict who can and can't vote, but I do think it's a sensible thing to say you need some level of knowledge to be able to vote.
But in my case, and the reason I used sort of Spanish as an example is that I reached a point where I thought, I understand Spanish and I don't need to learn any more about it. I know it. And truthfully, Socrates would know that I don't know as much as I could do, and I could always improve it, right? Because I don't know it. I mean, there are words I don't know. There's turns of phrase that I'm not aware of. But most people get this idea about things. They understand that, and then they move on, right? And so you could have someone who's 70 years old and has a great understanding of business, but doesn't know how to use the internet, doesn't know about modern, I don't know, logistical improvements or whatever it may be. Do you know what I mean? And so they're kind of stuck in the past. And would they have a right because they maybe got a degree in computers when computers were very, very new, and then thought they understood computers and never bothered really? I mean, I'm using that as an example. So I think someone who is interested in computers to get to a degree would be wanting to keep up with it. But you know, if you learned about a particular subject and the world moves on and there's new information, but you're not a party to that new information because you cannot understand that subject, then you've in theory got a lot of experience, but you may be completely, behind the scenes.
I would envisage it as moderately simple, but what does this particular party stand for? And then, I mean, so for example, if you can't name any of the policies that the party that you're voting for have, should you be voting for that party? So it doesn't necessarily have to, if it were the case that, 20 years ago a party stood for one thing and now they don't, should you be able, I don't know. There's a freedom issue to it as well, but
yeah, you've got the right to make a decision based on whatever criteria you like. And you don't have to have any, currently at least in the system, you don't have to have any knowledge. But I think most people vote Conservative because they vote Conservative and Labour because they vote Labour.
I think that's a good enough reason. Because you support a team, that's essentially what it is.
That's what it is.
My team.
Yeah.
And a lot of these things, a little bit of psychology, is the only reason you go for a particular party. That's a bit of a generalisation, but there's certain evidence to suggest that you are a supporter of a particular party based on your character. So if you're a particular way, if you're very, for example, capable and don't like to be told what to do, for example, you're more likely to be on the right than you are on the left. If you have a priority that you like to look after people, you're more likely to be on the left than you are on the right. So it's actually not about objectively what's right for a country. It's about me. What do I value? Which is not how you should implement policies for a particular country.
So what you're advocating then is some kind of system whereby, in order to vote, you need to do some kind of test to show that you understand what the parties who you're voting for stand for.
I think you should be able to name some policies. It shouldn't be too difficult, but if you can't name any of the policies that...
So you have a short exam, 10 questions. If you don't get them right, then you have to do the exam again and again until such time as you get them right.
That's very detailed. And considering I haven't thought anything about this, I've been thinking about Socrates. I probably wouldn't commit to any particular type of definition of what that test would be. But it would need to be simple enough to justify the fact that everyone has eligibility to vote. But if you can't name any of the policies...
All of these changes, though, I think, don't come into play and don't get even talked about because, as you very rightly mentioned before, people work in their self-interest. So if you assume then that you're in a position of power, it's not in your self-interest to dilute that power.
That's the reason why there's not online voting, which you've alluded to before.
Yeah.
Because that would have such a sway on
I agree
how
with you.
people vote.
I think to have some kind of system whereby you show that you're engaged, in other words, some kind of test, right? Or you've got to have read something. I don't know how it works. I haven't given it that much thought. But you've got to prove that you've actually thought about it. Or even if you don't read it, whatever it is, or you just go to the bottom and say, I tick this to say that I've done it. I mean, who's to say? But some kind of thing, and then you vote online. But I don't even see why we need parties anymore. Political parties have been around for hundreds of years. Is that necessarily? I mean, I don't hear people questioning this at all. I mean, is it necessary to have a Labour Party and a Conservative Party. If I was a Conservative, a member of the Conservative Party, we come back to this as well. Consistency. So when I'm a teenager or a young adult, I decide that yes, I want to be a Conservative MP, or I'm really into that, or Labour, or whatever other party it is, right? So then you go through your life, and now you're having to be consistent. You can't then go back when you're in your 30s or your 40s and say, well, I think I was wrong. I mean, people do, and they change parties, and the party itself goes off and veers off in a different direction, and they're no longer aligned with it. But generally speaking, the majority of people do not. And if you've been elected as a member of parliament for whatever party it may be, then you've got a kind of responsibility to the people who elected you, assuming that they actually even knew your name or what you stood for, which we've just talked about is in many cases probably not true. But you've got to stick with what you started with, if you know what I mean. And that doesn't inspire, and it also inspires you've got to toe the party line, and you get the party whips, which are basically using some kind of, in my view, a kind of form of weak blackmail, maybe, or even in some cases strong blackmail. I think it's very interesting to watch I like Billions, the TV show, and I've got something on you, or the House of Cards. It's like, I know something about you, and I can release this. I can use it as leverage against you to bend you to my will. And this really is all about self-interest, and it really has got very little to do with improving the lot for society.
Yeah, what I was going to say when you mentioned the part that the politicians aren't doing it is that I do think that when you get into politics, what you see your job as is not solving problems for the good of the people. It's staying in power.
Yeah,
that's what your job is. So it doesn't. If one of those overlaps, maybe that's a good thing.
I think in many cases it does in their mind.
Yeah, but I think the priority is. So, for example, if you're sitting in office, you're using maybe the last half or maybe the last year of your election time to win another election after that. So it's not necessarily, you're not prioritising the people, you're prioritising the fact that you have to stay in power for that term.
So at the moment, there are an awful lot of problems in the UK, but we've spent the last 3 or 4 years now talking about Brexit in politics, and that's been their main focus.
What a waste of time.
Utter waste of time. And but anyway, after the local elections, it became clear for a lot of politicians came out and said, it's clear that the people have said that they just want us to get on with it, with Brexit. And that's what we'll do. And it made me think, there's some problems with this. First of all, that's an assumption on your part. Because you've not actually asked the people, do you want to get on with Brexit? Or do you want another referendum? Or you're making an assumption. People voted against the Conservative Party, against the Labour Party, on other parties. But you've never asked them the question. You've never gone to them and said, do you want us to just do Brexit regardless? Or do you want us to have a second referendum? Or, there's no questions. There could be a number of different questions asked, and people could actually have a referendum. Yeah. Instead, they say, you've said your piece, and we've listened to you, and we understand what you're saying, and it's that you want us to get on with Brexit. And I think, well, no. Certainly when I voted, that wasn't what I was asking for. I wasn't asking for you to get on with Brexit. So you're definitely wrong when it comes to me and a couple of people I've spoken to.
Maybe a little fallacy there going on.
A big fallacy. And the other point is that if you're saying you've made your voice clear and you want us to get on with Brexit, now that means that were you not getting on with Brexit before for the last 3 years? What's changed? You're supposed to be doing that already. So, I mean, the politicians' arguments there, they're like children. They go on and they make these statements in public, on TV. And what really infuriates me is that nobody seems to pick up on this. So can we incorporate Socrates into this? Is there some kind of system that people could be using which would help identify nonsense like the stuff that comes out of most politicians' mouths?
Well, I was going to say, because we're probably ending, we can go on if needed, but we're probably getting near the end of the call, that I would do some quotes, and then you can tell me what you think about Socrates.
Okay.
And some of these quotes, I think, would answer your question. And I mean, the Socratic method would help there in the sense that if a politician were to say, the people want us to get on with Brexit, you could just ask, well, what makes you think that that's the case?
Yeah.
And then they would have to defend their position because they make a claim. Like, we've done a video on the burden of proof, and there's not much of a burden of proof to that claim.
No.
And it's the difference between making a claim and asking people to back up their claim is huge. And that's why it's so much easier to ask people to defend their position than it is to actually provide evidence and make a claim for something.
Okay.
But coming back to the first step that we talked about, which is the beginning of wisdom is a definition of terms. So, and that's defining the words that we're talking about, so that we're both talking about the same thing. And even if I know what I'm talking about because I'm using words that I can't even define myself. I cannot teach anyone anything. I can only make them think. And that, I think, addresses what you were saying about the fact that, are you actually trying to solve problems and talk about ideas, or are you just defending a conclusion that you've already reached without even thinking about whether or not it's good or bad or whatever?
I think this is what the system, our current system, is based on. I think it's an incredibly old-fashioned point of view, and they should get with the time, because it isn't the best method, and shouldn't be. It's like if you question it, it's almost, to me, you see, modern politics is almost like the Catholic Church of the medieval times, where it was, don't you dare question us, or you're a heretic. Do you know what I mean? It's a bit like that. When you hear about, our current Prime Minister saying that you can't have a second referendum because the people have spoken, and if they have another referendum, then there's that's anti-democratic. We're not honouring their choice. So that means that the people are not allowed to change their mind. Well, in fact, we've already had a referendum on Europe in 1973. I can't remember exactly when. Roughly around in the 1970s, there was a referendum on Europe, and Britain said, yes, let's go into Europe. Now, things have changed since then. So what is it? What defines the reason why you can have a second referendum? Is it because things have changed? Is it because you realise that you were wrong? Are you not able to ever change your mind? And people say, well, if you just have another referendum again and again and again until you get the right result, then even after you've got the right result, the result that you're looking for, you could just have another referendum and overturn it again. Well, isn't that what's going on? If you sort of take the last sort of 100 years or so and you squish it down into the timeline, you push it down, isn't that what politics is? And
what my position is here, though, is in the sense that you need to implement things if you voted on it. And if they want to change their minds after that, then you vote on it, and then you can change your mind and you implement that.
I agree, except that I'd say that if there is enough ground, which there clearly is in this case, to say that perhaps things haven't gone the way we wanted. So say you're driving along the motorway, right? And you're in London and you want to go to Brighton. So you're driving along the motorway and you suddenly realise hang on, I took the wrong turning and I'm going towards, instead of going towards Brighton, I'm going into Croydon. So what do? You continue driving into Croydon until you reach the centre of London, until you drive right across London, until you get to the M25 again, and then you turn all the way around and come back. Or do you turn round and go back and say, I think I made a mistake?
The people who want to go to London would say that they don't want to go to Brighton. So the people who voted for Brexit are already still in favour of Brexit.
Yeah.
So,
but if you weren't sure, would you then at some point stop to ask directions or to check your sat nav or something to find out, would you not say, hang on, I think I might be going in the wrong direction? Let's pose this question again.
The reason why I mention the implementation is that let's say we voted again, and it was the Remain vote. Why would that be implemented? Why should it be implemented?
Well,
why don't people just crash out?
First of all, I think the big problem that people are frightened of with regard to that is that then you have the fabled 17.4 million people who voted to leave would feel betrayed, and so that's not good enough. You can't betray these people. Well, the people who, I actually voted to remain, and I have a number of different reasons for it, and I'm not always right, and I'm not going to say that the European Union is a good institution, because I don't think it is, but I voted to remain partly because of how it affects me directly, and I have been very negatively affected by Brexit already financially, but also because I think that whether you like it or not, if you look at the continuum of human existence, we are going towards globalization, and I think it's an inevitability. I think we'll either go to become more and more globalized to the point where it's just, that's it, or we'll go through a series of wars, and at the end of those wars we'll either start moving towards globalization again until we reach globalization, true globalization, or society will break down and we'll never reach true globalization. So I think it's just part of the continuum, and I think rather than fight against it, I think we should be actively trying to see how we can improve it. And I think round the corner there's a lot of big issues that none of the politicians are talking about at all, because they're all focused on Brexit. And it's a smokescreen to me.
My question was just around the fact that if a vote doesn't mean that you then take the action on that vote, if we were to have another referendum, why would we implement remaining?
Okay. So I've got a question. I've got an answer, I think. And as you know, my answers aren't predetermined. I'm open. This is my current opinion, and I'd like to think that I'm flexible of mind enough to change my mind, and I might change my mind in due course. But at the moment, we had a referendum in 1970 something to go into Europe. Then things have changed, time, new voters, whatever. And now we've had another referendum to leave Europe. Very, very close referendum, and not very well determined. And there's been all sorts of lies from both sides. There was never. It didn't seem to me that the leave side had any clear view on what would happen if they won.
That might be an argument for having some form of test before you actually vote.
There you go. That is a good thing. I'm all for that. Yeah. But my point is this. So you've got Theresa May, who said you can't have a second referendum. The people have already spoken. Well, we've already had 2 referendums for a start. Big time difference, but still we've had 2 referendums. So we need to implement this regardless. But then she's also the same person who's then tried to push her own deal through 3 or 4 times. So it's okay for people who are elected to continuously vote on the same thing until they get the result. Well, she still hasn't got the result she was looking for. But it's okay for her to have people do the same vote again and again and again and again. And yet the people, if we were to have the same vote again, or even a version of it, a different version, a better version of it, it's still then a betrayal of democracy. I can't ever see how having a vote to the people, giving the people a vote, can ever be a betrayal of democracy.
Yeah, you might, as you say, vote on a version of it. So, again, the politicians might be presuming that we have to do things a certain way, whereas if you were to get the people to vote on something, like is it a big deal that we have to delay it for a year or something like that? That might be a vote. Like how quickly would you like it implemented? That might be a vote, because that is presupposed.
Could you not? The other day, if you recall, you got an email which said something, and it was open to interpretation. It was a bit ambiguous, and you yourself thought, I think it means this. And then I got the email and I thought, oh, does it mean this or does it mean that? And you and I both jumped to different conclusions about the same email because the email was ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
And so the obvious solution was to go back to the person who sent the email and ask them, did you mean A or did you mean B? And then we got the answer. And it doesn't matter if you were right or I was right. Well, I was right, but
well, it wasn't so obvious.
It was ambiguous, right? So it could easily have been you or it could have been me, and it was 50-50. And the worst thing is if we'd have both come to the same conclusion, and therefore not even noticed that it was ambiguous in the first place, because it has consequences. So I don't know how that works into things exactly, but it seems to me that if leaving Europe is more complex and isn't going to get the results that we were expecting, etc., 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 then there is an argument for a second referendum, and there's an argument for not having a second referendum.
There's only an argument from the perspective of people who don't want to leave, and that's the problem with it. If you do want to leave and you voted to leave, there isn't an argument for it, and that's like if you could apply it to every single election.
I think you should.
You could say the same thing about Hillary and Donald Trump, in the sense that it was a close election, in the same way that Brexit was, and the people who supported Hillary Clinton would have done anything and everything to change the result of it.
But that's only 4 years, maximum 8, whereas Brexit is really steering a different course, potentially. So if it's the question: do you want to go to Brighton or do you want to go to London? And you're at Gatwick Airport. So if you want to go to London, you drive towards London. If you want to go to Brighton, you drive towards Brighton. But at the moment, we're kind of driving around and around and around, not really knowing which way to go. And the biggest problem in that is that it has really divided the country in half. What I suggest is the best way forward would be to ask the people, do they want another referendum or not? And that way, if the people say, yes, we want another referendum, then you've got no political argument for saying, well, we're betraying the people, because the people have had a referendum on whether they want another referendum on Brexit. And if the people say no...
Would that not turn into multiple elections for every election, or multiple votes for every election? Because then you just get, well, do you want another vote about this for every time someone gets elected?
No, because I think it's different, because the way don't get me started, because I don't like the current version of democracy that we've got. I don't think it's very democratic. I think it's very old-fashioned. It's served us very well for many, many hundreds of years.
If democratic is in fact a good thing.
Okay, well that's another topic for discussion.
As we've talked about with Socrates.
Okay, but I just think that a simple solution would be to get clarification.
I don't know that I'm open to the discussion, but I don't know what's different about the Brexit vote to any other election. What is it that is significant enough to say we should do something different on this occasion, whereas another vote for a different topic, you couldn't just say the exact same thing?
Well, the whole reason we had this in the first place is because, as I understand it, the main reason that we even had a referendum in the first place is because of Tory infighting, because the Tory party, the Conservative Party, who is in power, is kind of split. Half of them want to leave Europe and half of them want to stay in it. But leaving Europe is not the same as continuing with the status quo, whether it's right or wrong, whether it's good or bad. You either stay with what you're doing or you change direction. And that change of direction can have huge implications.
It's the same as any other election.
It isn't, because it's a big change in direction compared to...
Define big.
Well, it defines all our laws. It defines the freedom of movement.
It may not. We could have exactly the same laws and be outside Europe.
But that sort of negates the reason for leaving in the first place.
We can change them, whereas we couldn't change them if we were in Europe.
So what you're saying is that we could have the right to change laws, but we wouldn't probably change them.
We may not.
Yeah, I just think this is the whole thing is a big smokescreen. I think there is a big difference because we were within this group, and now we're talking about moving and changing, and it's going to have trade implications, and we've already seen it. The motor industry, the car industry, is in real problems, and I think is going to be for the next 20 years in even ever deeper problems, because I don't see much need for cars on their current level at the moment. I mean, they're constantly manufacturing because they have to manufacture. And we don't really need that many cars. Now, it's hard to park because there's so many cars.
It's a UK issue, isn't it?
It's not just UK, but yeah, it's definitely a UK
Densely
issue.
populated countries.
Yeah. But there's more and more cars being manufactured because the current economic system requires for the companies to do this. But in the future, I see far less need for cars than we've currently got. And I just don't think we're going to have them. I might be wrong on this, of course, but it seems to me that once cars actually get to the point where they drive themselves around, they're not going to need to park. And you're not going to need to go, because 95% of the time I've got a car and it's parked outside. I only use it to come to work and back and go to the shop or pick up my daughter from school. 95% of the time it's just sitting there doing nothing. And that's really inefficient. And one thing I know about capitalism, like it or hate it, is that it really does work to make things more efficient. And I cannot see, when cars are able to drive themselves, why you'd want a car sitting idle for 95% of the time. I think what we'll see is the same number of cars driving around the roads, but we won't have cars parked.
Be some sort of subscription service.
Some kind of subscription service, exactly. And when you need your car, it turns up, the next car comes along, picks you up, like a taxi. It just picks you up and drops you off where you want to go, and then it drives off on its merry way to pick up the next person who needs it, like a carpooling system. That's the future of cars. And if you think that, say, 90% of the time cars aren't in use, then logically you need only one car for every 10 that there are currently on the roads. You might have the same number of cars driving around, but they're just never parking because they don't need to park. And you don't need to own a car because you just, why do you need a car? All the difficulties with having a car. So you join this carpooling system. So if you're a car manufacturer now, and that's looks like it's the most likely outcome of what's going to happen in the future, you must be bricking it. So
electric cars, I think, will have a short-term demand at least. But I was just thinking when you said that about, it picks up one person and the next time it picks up a different person.
Yeah.
What you might find in the car.
Yeah.
Like someone's been out on a night out and vomited in the car or something like that, and then you.
But the car would be smart and it would realise this, and it would know who you were, and you would be fined for it automatically.
Maybe.
I mean, there are solutions to all these problems, but going back to the Brexit issue, you got Sunderland, which had 6,000 people working in the Honda factory. Is it Honda? Well, and they've left Sunderland now. They said, we will not leave Sunderland, but they've left it, and the main reason they've left it is because Sunderland was is because of the insecurity about what's happening, because companies need to be able to plan in advance. The people who ran this country probably never even went to Sunderland. They're probably in Tokyo or somewhere, and they just made a very simple. So there's a problem here. This car plant is a country, we don't know what's going to happen with trade and this, that, and the other. Let's just move it to here where we know things are going to be secure. And this is a direct result of Brexit. And 2 out of 3 people roughly in Sunderland voted to leave Europe. Presumably, you'd hope at least, not the people who work in the plant itself, who had been reassured that they won't leave. But they have.
It'd be interesting to see what happens with it, regardless.
Yeah.
And one of the famous quotes from Socrates that people tend to use a lot is "Know thyself."
Ah, yes, I know this one. That's a good one. And I think that's something that we're always striving, well, at least I am always striving to do, is to know myself. Remember, as a teenager, as in my early 20s, I felt very insecure. And there used to be a TV show and they'd have all these people on, and they'd always seem really confident, these TV guests. And I always remember thinking to myself, oh my God, if I was I can't imagine myself being a guest on TV, because I'd be so insecure. I wouldn't be relaxed. I wouldn't be confident. I'd be worrying about saying the wrong thing. And now I would be okay, because I know myself a lot more than I did back then. So I really like that one.
Well, there's a funny one to end with for myself, and then you can tell me what you think about Socrates.
Okay.
And it is, I was really too honest a man to be a politician and live.
And live.
Because obviously he was sentenced to death by the state, and he was completely honest about what his positions were.
Yeah.
Which I like that one.
That's a good one. And again, it's a whole... So it comes back to that movie I was talking about, I think. The Circle. Where it's all about being transparent and not having any secrets. I think in the movie, if I remember rightly, she says something along the lines of, secrets are lies.
Not sure about that one.
Yeah. I think it's a bit simplistic,
I think,
the movie generally.
if we
but
subjected that statement to the Socratic method, it might not stand up under scrutiny.
Yeah, well, I think I like what you've told us today about Socrates, because I like that he was an independent thinker. I think that's really important, is to try and know thyself, sure, but part of that is to just not blindly follow people and think for yourself about things and realise that you might not always be right, or you might not have the right level of information to form a set opinion. Socrates, hell of a fellow. Robin Hood, don't know. Socrates, real, make believe.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that question is it doesn't matter.
Doesn't.
So whether the ideas are some form of fiction or whether it's literally what he said makes no difference.
Robert Kiyosaki, rich man, poor man. Rich dad, poor daddy. Also Jesus.
It matters a lot to Christians whether or not Jesus was actually a real person.
This is the smokescreen thing again, because actually in real terms it doesn't matter a jot. In fact, it's better almost if he wasn't divine in any way, and yet he was a real person, in my view, because that means he's one of us. He's a person. He's not special in some way. He's just a normal person. And it doesn't really matter. But the point of the matter is that I think that for a long, long time, you could be burned at the stake for even questioning whether he was real or not. And that's definitely wrong. But I also think that his name and his teachings have been twisted terribly in the name of religion. And I think that if you get rid of, or you wipe all that out, and you say it doesn't matter if he was a real person or an imaginary sort of creation, it doesn't matter if he was a normal human being or the Son of God, what he was actually saying is what's important. That was his message, and all the other stuff is just confusing his message. Anyway, that's another topic.
That is something we could have covered in the last podcast, which is about religion. But
yeah,
I think we touched on some of those things.
But to me, it doesn't matter. I mean, if you're going to be a Christian, you follow Jesus, you follow Christ, right? But that doesn't mean believing in him. That doesn't mean not questioning him, or indeed spending time trying to question him. It should be about listening to what he said, or what he was reported to have said, and the messages and trying to live in that way.
Well, I suppose I think it matters if you take a literal position on it, because the whole thing is about believing. The only way to the heavens or whatever is through me, and there's lots of reference to belief in the Bible, especially.
Except, sadly, he didn't
Jesus.
ever write anything down, so all of these are interpreted.
There's a theme here, isn't there?
Yeah. And if he did write things down, that's been long since deleted, lost, burnt.
Well, the one
whatever.
thing I was going to mention
adapted.
to you about this, which is a good thing that you said that, because the analogy I was going to share with you is imagine, because it's quite a long time frame from when they said the thing and when it was written down, especially with Socrates, and I think that's the case. Scholars or whatever have said that about Jesus. Imagine 10 or 20 years from now, and imagine being able or having the task of writing down the conversations that you and I had in our podcasts.
Or even 5 minutes from now.
How difficult would that be?
Even a minute from now.
Yeah. I mean, there would be errors for one thing.
Sure.
But
and people would interpret things the wrong way, as we know.
People interpret things different ways, the same thing happening.
Yeah.
And if there's a significant amount of time that's passed between one and the other, I think that's just going to be completely inaccurate. Even if
like if you watch a football match and you got two opposing teams, right? And you got fans that support one and fans that support another, and they will have a completely opposing view of the match. So
sort of like Brexit.
Yeah, a bit like Brexit. What they should do is just replay the match. Anyway, so
you like Socrates?
I think Socrates was a hell of a fella.
And are you going to use the Socratic method?
I think in some ways I already do, without knowing it, unwittingly use it. But now that I understand what it is, I think I shall give it a bit more thought and maybe make more of a process out of it. But one thing that I've listened to, the audiobook version of many, many times, is How to Win Friends and Influence People. And in that book, he mentions where someone makes a quote and says it's from the Bible at a big dinner party, and he says, actually, you'll find that's Shakespeare. Or it was the other way around, actually, I think. He said, Shakespeare said blah, blah, blah. And he said, actually, that was from the Bible. Doesn't really matter which way around it was. He embarrassed his host. He embarrassed his friend who'd invited him to the dinner party, and he embarrassed the person who'd made the speech, who then felt that he had to defend himself and his position, and it was a wrong position, and he embarrassed basically everybody else in the room.
If you want to listen to our episode on how to win friends and influence people, it is episode 14.
Episode 14.
Side note, we talked about that a lot.
Yeah. So, anyway, the reason I mention this is because it's not always good to point out when you know someone's made a mistake and when they're wrong. And you said that Socrates was not very popular.
No, but I heard something yesterday, which could have been the day before, one of the two, which I thought was really interesting, and it was about the failure of philosophy. Ooh. And about how if you look at all of the, not all, but some of the topics within, for example, science or physics, how much they've progressed and what an impact they've had on society.
Yeah.
Philosophy is about...
We're still quoting ancient Greeks.
That, and how much impact has it actually had on our society. So, for example, we're discussing something and we've highlighted areas where there's instances that occur regularly. Politics, for example, no one sort of calls them on these things. No one knows how to, show people that they're wrong, for example. And the reason for that is people who know, let's say philosophers, for the sake of, let's say it's you and I, for example. Let's say someone's wrong tomorrow for whatever reason. Yeah. Are we going to correct them on their thinking? And the answer is that philosophers, generally speaking, will just let people know, let people stay in their, let's say they've got flawed thinking, not highlight to people that they haven't, they've arrived at a faulty conclusion, or they're incorrect in some way, or let's say they're too combative, or they don't have the right tools or the right methods to be able to change people's minds, and that is a failure of philosophy, because it hasn't had any impact in hundreds or even thousands of years to allow people to make better decisions.
One way is, and again from that book, it's that guy who's selling vans, and he would argue with people that his van was the better van, and he eventually came around after listening to Carnegie in one of his conversations, or one of his just town hall meetings, discussions about how to win friends and influence people. He changed his tack and stopped arguing with people and said, yeah, the white van company is great and it does this and does that and does the other. No, our cars can do all of that, but they're cheaper, or they can do this as well. So, and it occurred to me and the reason I mention this is because the other day, we're marketeers, so we know that we can't actually, you can't change someone's opinion unless they are ready to have their opinion changed. You can't expect to have someone who's got a set view. Say you're a born again Christian, right? You're not going to walk into a room and have someone.
Always a born again Christian.
You're always a born again Christian. You certainly are. You can't expect to walk into a room and an hour later walk out and be no longer a born again Christian. Now there may be some cracks that appear, and it may be a process, but there is a process, and to be clever, you're going to have to be able to identify that process in someone and go, well, this person's not ready for this level of information yet. You're not going to, if you want to teach someone to read, you don't suddenly give them War and Peace.
Well, that comes back to the Socrates quote, doesn't it? I don't know it word for word, but it's something along the lines of, I can't convince one of anything, but I can only make them think, something along those lines. So maybe the goal of a philosopher, or someone who feels like they have, or someone who is capable of reasoning or using logic, is to make people think and not to change their minds. Maybe that's a good
At the moment,
goal.
There's an advert on TV. I don't watch a lot of TV, but I noticed this advert because it stood out to me. And it's the AA, the Automobile Association, and it's Green Flag, who's a competitor, and the advert's by Green Flag. And they say, at Green Flag, we believe that the AA is great. They do this, they do that. And no, he said, and like the AA, we also have, we can attend to you all over the UK, we do this, we do that, we do that. So they're also, instead of people who might say, well, I like the AA because of this, because of that, they're not trying to smash down the AA, they're aligning themselves with the AA. So they're sweeping people, a bit like Aikido, where someone comes to attack you and you turn them round into how you want them to be. So you face them the direction that is beneficial to you. And that's what that advert's doing. It's saying, we're just like the AA, and we already know you like the AA because that's a supposition. So we know because the AA have got much larger percentage of the market, and they're trying to win people over from the AA. And at the end of the advert, they say, we love the AA, they're great, they do this, like us, they do this, they do that, they do this, they do that, but we're cheaper.
And if you're listening to this from the Green Flag, feel free to get in touch about a small fee for that slight plug.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm with the AA, so it might be working.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, I've been with the AA for years, and I in fact called them out relatively recently, a couple of weeks ago, and they were excellent. They arrived within 20 minutes. So if Green Flag can do all of those things, wow.
And more.
Yeah. But what's more concerning is in the future when people don't own their own cars, what are these companies going to do then?
How will the vomit be cleaned up?
How will it be cleaned? Anyway, I think, Socrates, hell of a fella. Philosophy, maybe not. Hasn't really. He's been a bit of a perennial underachiever, perhaps.
An underachiever, I think that's a good conclusion.
But you love it anyway.
I do love it. I think the more we can get to objective truth, I think the better. And
it makes you question things, right? Philosophy makes you think about things.
That's a principle
that's what subjective is.
I've talked to you about it before. We've mentioned it before, and that is the more you're convinced of a particular opinion or a particular position, the more skeptical you should be, because it highlights a bias that you might have.
Excellent. I think that's a great place to finish.
Maybe a thought of the day.
Thought of the day. Can you just repeat it?
I was struggling to get it out the first time. So the more convinced you are of a particular position, the more sceptical you should be, and the more evidence-based or more objective you should be about that thing, because it may highlight one of your biases.
Fantastic. There you go. And that came from Socrates.
I think it's a principle rather than a quote, but
it doesn't matter. I mean, you don't need to quote people perfectly. What you need to do is understand that. That's one of my issues with exams. You need to be able to quote this, but no, you don't. You need to be able to understand what it really means. You can quote the Bible left, right, and centre, but do you understand what Jesus meant? I don't know. Anyway, we should finish where you said that.
All right. Well, until next time.
Hasta la vista,
Bye.
baby.